CBS News World headquarters in New York with Anthony Mason and Ed Bradley. It's 1:30 now in the East. Here are the headlines of the hour on the attack on America, which President Bush today declared an act of war. That was his word. SWAT teams raided Boston's Westin Hotel this afternoon, an action that may or may not be related to the terror attacks, although Jim Stewart just reported the FBI had some leads on information that might be in a hotel room, and that's what this raid in Boston was about. Two of the aircraft hijacked yesterday took off from Boston's Logan Airport. The official death toll in the attacks that brought down New York's World Trade Center towers stands at 41, but thousands are still missing. That includes 259 firefighters and police officers. Outside Washington, D.C., parts of the Pentagon are still burning. 73 survivors were pulled from the building, and defense officials now say they do not expect to find any more survivors. The number of Pentagon dead is now expected to be well below the highest estimate that some news organizations were kicking around yesterday and last night of 800. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld thinks the death toll at the Pentagon will be well below 800, but may very well be in the low hundreds. Commercial air traffic is still shut down coast to coast, with the FAA undecided when to lift its ban. Yes, it was supposed to go off at noon today Eastern Time, but the FAA in the end did not lift the ban. No one knows when any kind of air travel will be resumed, but the FAA is in the process of deciding. And no one should expect, we're told, that even when the ban on air travel is lifted, no one should expect that all airlines at all airports will immediately get back to anything approaching normal. Let's check back in with Jim Stewart in Washington on the continuing investigation into who was responsible for these acts of terror. Jim?
Dan, the FBI has conducted a raid on the Westin Hotel in downtown Boston. This is a special weapons and tactics team that was seen entering the hotel. Our information is that the FBI believed that one of the hijackers possibly stayed in a room at the hotel. Some people have been taken into custody, but no one, I repeat, no one to our knowledge has been arrested in connection with the events that occurred yesterday. So the people that have been taken into custody are apparently wanted for questions regarding their status with the INS. Additional search warrants are being conducted this afternoon in Florida, specifically around two commercial aviation schools there, where it is thought that possibly some of the men involved in hijacking those aircraft yesterday received their sophisticated training on how to fly commercial aircraft. Federal agents also are releasing some detail of what occurred with the mystery flight, if you will, yesterday of United Flight 93. That's the one that was headed from Newark to San Francisco, apparently hijacked and crashed somewhere in Pennsylvania as it had turned to head back toward the Washington, D.C. area. They say that plane was a part of this process of hijackings and terrorist events, and that a passenger aboard that plane made a phone call and described that other passengers had begun fighting with the men who had hijacked this aircraft. Apparently, in the process of that fight, the aircraft did go down. Federal agents say they assumed that its target was somewhere either in the Camp David or Washington, D.C. area. It is now, of course, impossible to tell. Dan?
Jim, Dateline Boston, the Associated Press quotes one reporter on the scene as saying that one person was taken out of the hotel in a van, one person was arrested, and that one person was wounded in that combined FBI police raid on the hotel. Do you have any indication whether that report is true or not?
Dan, I have no knowledge of anyone being wounded. The only precise information I have is that people who have been taken into custody, who are literally under arrest, if you will, are being held on charges that are not related directly to the events yesterday, who may have been in violation of some INS. That is not to say that the raid that was conducted at this location won't turn up evidence of some of the people who did participate having stayed at the hotel. But right now, I'm told there have been no arrest of people who were accomplices in the attacks yesterday, and I will quote you one senior official who told me, frankly, he's not holding his breath that we will see any such arrest today. And one postscript, Dan, and that is, as I'm sure you'll recall, during the Oklahoma City bombing, we went through a period of days after the bombing in which there were a series of arrests on an almost hourly basis of people who appeared to resemble John Doe 2 and other tips that proved to be wrong. I anticipate we're going to see a whole spat of those before this day is out. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. Let's electronically skip to Boston and 48 Hours producer, CBS News reporter Josh Yeager. Josh?
Dan, still at the Westin Copley, where for the last 5 minutes the scene has been pandemonium. This crowd, now at more than 10,000 in my estimation, has been pushed back against its will by police. About 5 minutes ago, a squad of 15 to 20 police, heavily armed in riot gear, came out of the front of the hotel, holding up riot shields. We were in the process of being pushed back, and I was actually knocked over. Couldn't see it myself, but people in a different vantage point reported seeing one person brought out of the hotel, as Jim Stewart reported, put into a silver, secure van. The police then cleared us back even further and have parked 50-some-odd police motorcycles, 2 ambulances in front of the hotel, and cordoned off the whole area with yellow tape. Someone else I spoke to in the crowd, I should mention, said that he saw 3 people being taken out and put in the van. I can't confirm that either way for you. Dan?
Josh Yeager in Boston. Now we go back to Washington. CBS News correspondent Bob Orr, who's come up with some additional information about what happened on the 4 hijacked flights yesterday. Bob?
Dan, I'm most intrigued by what correspondent Jim Stewart just told us about United Airlines Flight 93. And it may go a long way to understanding why that particular plane did not make its target, whatever that target was. We showed you the radar track yesterday on that plane, and it took off from Newark in a normal course across the northern tier of states bound for San Francisco. But as it got out around the Cleveland, Ohio area, it started to turn around in virtually a U-turn and head back towards the Pittsburgh vicinity. Air traffic controllers tried several times, we're told, to radio that cockpit crew to find out what was going on, and there was no response. We now know from these cell phone calls that what was going on is there was at least 3 hijackers on the plane, and apparently a scuffle broke out. Passengers took what might turn out to be very heroic action and at least distracted the hijackers and maybe thwarted their attempt. In any case, we know from the radar tapes what happened. This plane was on a relatively normal, and I use that word advisedly, easterly course when it got over the Somerset County, Pennsylvania area, and then it suddenly rolled over sharply and nosed down in a very high impact. This crater, I'm told, is 20 to 30 feet deep, and a good bit of the plane has been buried by the crash impact. This is a Boeing 757, relatively easy to fly. A hijacker with rudimentary skills, or certainly one with good skills, would have no problem whatsoever controlling this airplane. I myself, coincidentally, just last week flew the Boeing 757 in a simulator, and I can tell you that it's, and I'm not a pilot, it's relatively easy to control. However, if some kind of ruckus breaks out in the cockpit, if there's pushing and shoving, somebody leaning against the control column, that would make the plane completely uncontrollable. One more thing. One of the callers said that all of the passengers were ushered by the hijackers to the back of the plane. Now, there weren't that many people on the plane, but if you get a sudden shift in weight on an airliner like that, what happens is the nose can either pitch up or down. In this case, it would pitch up. If you're not right on the controls when that happens, the thing that's most likely to happen is the plane continues to climb until it stalls. It then would peel over and go down nose down. If, in fact, the passengers intervened and somehow thwarted the hijacking attempt, and the cockpit tape and the flight data recorder, when they're recovered, might make this case, then they should be observed in this case, Dan, as heroes.
Bob Orr. Ed Bradley, do we have any idea how many hijackers per plane? I mean, were they 3? Were they 6? Do we know?
The government believes now that there were 3 to 5 hijackers on each of those planes, and that more than one on each plane was a trained pilot. And also, I might add that you may have heard yesterday that the Attorney General giving a website for tips. Some 700 tips have already been received at that website that the Attorney General gave the address for yesterday. And the FBI has issued a search warrant on at least one major internet service in order to get information about an email address that may be connected to the terrorist attacks. One of the companies that received the warrant was Earthlink. They have said, along with AOL, which is the nation's largest internet provider, that it will comply with requests, and it will comply with requests in a hurry.
Ed Bradley. Let's go out to Seattle, Washington, and John Magnuson. of the firm that helped work on the World Trade Center. Mr. Magnuson, thank you for being with us. We saw two buildings collapse. It was an incredible scene. What other word can you use yesterday? We not only thought that this would never happen, we thought it couldn't happen. Why did it happen?
Well, both of the towers actually survived the initial impact from the airplanes, and they stood for about an hour. It was only when they finally were consumed by the fire from the jet fuel that they did collapse. We're actually just very thankful that the buildings didn't collapse immediately like most buildings would have, because that allowed many people to escape to safety.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. It wasn't the impact of the aircrafts on the structure of the building that caused them to collapse. It was the subsequent events, mostly the aviation fuel that exploded?
That's right. The structure was able to survive for at least another hour after the actual impact. And in an office building like the World Trade Center Towers or any other office building, there's two systems that are used to deal with the hazard from fire. The first system are the sprinkler systems in the building, and the other system is the fireproofing insulation on the structural steel. When structural steel gets up to about 1,500 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, it loses its strength. It loses its ability to carry load. In a normal building, the sprinklers would fight the fire, and then the insulation would protect the steel from reaching that 1,500 degree temperature. With this jet fuel fire, the sprinklers are designed to deliver water. Jet fuel fires, you need to have fire-suppressing foam to deal with that kind of a fire. So even if the sprinklers were intact, it would have been the wrong kind of extinguisher to put on the jet fuel fire.
Fascinating. When I was much younger, this is in the 1940s, I think, a plane rammed the Empire State Building. I don't know whether you recall that or not.
Yes.
You being much younger, but you must know about it. But the Empire State Building seemed to absorb that airplane crash, fuel and all. Help us understand the difference.
Right. We're talking about a significant difference in the quantity of the fuel that was on board. These were large, fully loaded jets. Back then, that was a much, much smaller jet. And both the buildings did survive the impact of the plane. And it was only this jet fuel fire that brought about the demise of the building.
Mr. Magnuson, this raises the question, your opinion, the people who flew these aircraft into the building, from what you've said, they must have had a great deal of knowledge of what it would take to bring down these buildings.
Well, you know, it would be difficult to speculate whether they knew precisely what they were doing or whether they just simply wanted to get as low on the building as they could without ramming into some of the other buildings in lower Manhattan there first. As it turned out, they hit at a very difficult spot on the building.
And they also selected aircraft that were loaded with aviation fuel. This gets more interesting as we discuss it, that all of these planes were bound for the West Coast and took off from the East Coast loaded with fuel. So here we have a situation we're asked to believe, and it's not that I disbelieve, but we're asked to believe that a kind of ragtag terrorist organization got somebody, several somebodies, at least four somebodies, knew how to fly sophisticated aircraft, at least for a short distance, selected those planes that would be absolutely loaded with aviation fuel, and crashed them into buildings, the Twin Towers, the World Trade Centers, that could not be destroyed by the impact of the aircraft, but could be destroyed and were destroyed by the fact that this aviation fuel got loose and just, in effect, melted the steel.
Right. I'm not sure if their intent was, they may have thought that the building would have collapsed instantly, like Oklahoma City courthouse did. But I'd hate to speculate about how much they knew or what they were thinking. The whole act is just unthinkable to me.
Well, those questions stay out there. Mr. Magnuson, the World Trade Center Twin Towers were built when?
Well, the design work was in the mid-1960s, and construction started in the late 60s and finished up in the early 70s. So it was about 35 years ago that they were designed.
And if one were to design such buildings today, I'm not suggesting they'd be rebuilt on this site or anything, but Those are questions yet to be answered. But would it be pretty much designed the same way, a tower such as this?
Yes, actually the design criteria would be very, very similar today for this kind of a building. If this building had been in an earthquake zone like California, there'd be significant differences in the design. But since the design of the World Trade Center Tower was really controlled by the wind load design and handling the hazards due to windstorms, its design today would be very, very similar to what was done 35 years ago.
Mr. Magnuson, when you saw those twin towers yesterday collapse, whether you saw it live as it happened or on videotape, as a structural engineer, tell me what you thought.
Well, I guess I ran through the whole range of emotions. The first thing was I couldn't believe what I saw, and then it was more shock. Then there was a sense of relief that they had survived the impact, and I saw the building standing with large holes in each side, and they were still standing. And then it went to concern about the nature of that fire. There was a fire in a high-rise building in Los Angeles, I think it was about 15 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, that they almost lost that building with a regular fire, with just conventional flames and fuel, no jet fuel. And so then I got to be quite concerned about what that might be doing in the building. And then it went all the way to the emotion of anger. Why would anyone do something like this?
And what were for some minutes towering infernos quickly became collapsing infernos.
Right.
John Maxson, thank you very much for being with us in Seattle. We go down to Scott Pelley, who's at Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. Scott?
Dan, I'm standing essentially between the two twin towers, or what is left of them. I'm in the area where a huge amount of debris has collapsed into the street. I see a lot of iron workers here, volunteers all, who've come from all over Manhattan and the New York area. They're standing on top of these girders, connecting them to cranes. Very large cranes are pulling them up. It looks like a very well-organized effort here. I'm in the area where a number of physicians and nurses and paramedics are standing by to treat anyone who comes out. But they've been telling me over the last few minutes that they haven't seen much of anything in the way of a sign of life in the last several hours. One nurse I was talking to, who came down here as a volunteer, located two bodies in this morning. One person, the other person had been quite burned. They were both deceased. Those bodies were, and the identification on them was taken in order to notify next of kin. The striking thing about this scene, Dan, I'm looking at hundreds and hundreds of people climbing all over this hideous mountain of debris, trying to tear it down, trying to get to the basement levels. The remarkable thing here is the lack of bodies, the fact that you don't see victims lying about. It is thought that they are buried in the center of the buildings under 110 stories of debris. Some of the basement areas, Dan, I'm told, are in remarkably good shape, did not collapse in some of the buildings. They have been searched and cleared, and no one was found alive in that area. But down here at the moment, hundreds and hundreds of people, iron workers, doctors, nurses, all standing by, tearing this building apart, looking for any sign of life. Dan?
Scott Pelley. And as we look at these remarkable pictures of men and women meticulously going through the debris and realizing that, as President Bush has said and Mayor Giuliani has said, that there are many, many people, how many we still do not know, buried in that debris. At the very least, it calls for a moment of silence to absorb this scene. The sights and sounds of Lower Manhattan. And they will go on through the day and again through the night. We go now back to Los Angeles International Airport and Sandra Hughes. Sandra?
Dan, more West Coast airport news. CBS News has learned that officials at Seattle-Tacoma Airport have been told by the FAA that they will be able to reopen the airport by 3 p.m. Pacific. That's 3 p.m. Pacific this afternoon. Now, that is only if the individual airlines have certification from the FAA that they comply with all safety and security measures. One sign at the Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and this might be a temporary measure, warns passengers no carry-on luggage. This even includes women's purses. All they will allow on board is a wallet. Dan?
Sandra Hughes, well, this is yet another development and yet another turn by the FAA, which is trying to get at least some airlines flying. Let's go to Bob Orr in Washington, who covers aviation for us. Bob, what's happening now? The FAA had said at first they might allow some flights at noon, then they said no, but now information comes that at least in the far west they're going to allow some flights.
And, Dan, I think it remains to be seen whether operations at SeaTac really do get off and running at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Frankly, the FAA and the Department of Transportation have been in high meetings throughout the night and the morning with the Department of Defense and with the White House, the national security folks, and they're trying to come up with a coordinated response that makes some sense, that balances the issue of the need to get the system back online from an economic sense, from a symbolism sense, against the very real risk that security could still be problematic. What Sandra Hughes said there is very important. One of the very first ways we expect the FAA to attack this security problem is to have this almost draconian crackdown on carry-on bags. Think about what happened yesterday. These hijackers went through, presumably, security checkpoints that are equipped with X-ray machines and metal detectors, principally designed to identify guns. Well, they didn't have guns. They had, we're told now, knife-like instruments, in one sense, box cutters with retractable knives. There is no equipment in place at any airport in America today that could take something that looks basically like this pen and identify it if it was in a travel case as a weapon. It's a significant vulnerable point in the aviation security system, and until the folks at the FAA and DOT really come to some kind of resolution as to how to figure out how to fix that, I don't think the planes are going to fly again, Dan. And certainly, even if they do start on a very limited basis in some spotty markets, the system is going to be badly impacted, if not gridlocked, for days, I think.
Bob Orr, live in our Washington Bureau. Let's now go to our chief Washington correspondent, Bob Schieffer. He's with United States Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, who, Bob, is my understanding, has just been briefed.
Yes, he has, and Senator Shelby is, Dan, was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee when the Republicans controlled the Senate. He's now the ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee and has always been one of the most informed senators on matters such as this. Senator, just bring us up to date. What is the latest? Where do we think this investigation is pointing to right now?
The investigation is ongoing in a big, big way. It's the #1 priority of the FBI and the Justice Department, and it should be in America. I'm sure there will be breaking news, but I'm not here to announce that because of the ongoing investigation. But I believe we will get to the bottom of this. But the question, Bob, is going to be, what are we going to do about it? It can't be a political response. It can't be a tepid response. It's going to be all-out war. The President talked about war. This is real war, and this is not going to go away if we don't really become aggressive to eradicate these cells, wherever they are, wherever they're being trained, wherever they're operating from, in a massive, destructive way. They're going to be coming back. If you don't carry the war to them, we're going to be waiting around, waiting for the next incident here in America. And the American people don't want that.
Well, I don't think there's any question that this Congress, at this particular point in time, would support this president in a war against whoever it is.
Whoever it is.
But who is it?
Well, we're not sure at this moment exactly who it is, but we're getting close, and we're going to know who it is. And when we know who it is, we're going after them. And it can't be a one-shot deal. It's got to be continued until they're gone.
Senator, at this point, though, you can't say, and the intelligence community is not certain at this point, is that correct,
who is behind this? I mean, there are many parallels to Osama bin Laden, but you can't say for sure.
Well, I'm not going to say right now. That would be ultimately up to the CIA director and perhaps the President of the United States to say, but I can tell you there are a lot of parallels. There are just too many. This was a very sophisticated, a well-planned operation with a lot of discipline. A lot of terrorist cells don't have that. I would venture to say that it is either Osama bin Laden and his group or some spin-off from it.
Senator, are you satisfied at this point with the intelligence on this operation? Should we have known about this? Is there any way on God's earth we could have known about it?
Well, that's the question. You know, if we didn't have any information, if we didn't have any inkling at all, then we've been hoodwinked. You know, we lost the day, and look at the results. But the intelligence community, all agencies, can do better than this if we put the resources behind it. But I think they're going to have to be much more aggressive. And we have great agencies. They've had a lot of good successes. But this was not a success. If it had been a success, it wouldn't happen.
Well, there is some question that perhaps the rules are too rigid now on who we can recruit for our human spies, as it were.
Well, I have advocated this, so is my colleague Senator Graham from Florida on the committee, that we've got to beef up. This has been going on 5 years that I chaired the committee. 5 years we've got to beef up the human intelligence. We've got to restructure NSA in a big way. There were people that wouldn't do that, said we don't need it. Today they know we need it.
Senator Shelby, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Well, Bob Schieffer interviewing, thank you, Bob, Senator Richard Shelby. And the senators, while saying he wasn't going to announce anything, clearly indicates that the briefing given to him is additional evidence that U.S. intelligence is pointing at Osama bin Laden and or at the very least what I think the senator called cells, terrorist cells associated with Osama bin Laden. So this is a significant development in terms of an indication of where the upper tiers of the U.S. government are going. It's one thing to talk about, well, maybe Saddam Hussein, maybe some state-sponsored terrorism, but the senator made it pretty clear that the indicators increasingly point to Osama bin Laden. We'll see what happens with that as time goes along. Now, bulletin from Washington, the FAA says airports will remain closed. We've had a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some indication maybe somewhere on the West Coast would ease up, but the FAA says airports to remain closed. They do not say when the airports will reopen. And so, Ed Bradley, this transportation emergency, again, trying not to use the word crisis, but transportation emergency will continue for at least another day.
We're not sure how long it will continue. And as I said before, I don't think that there will be a blanket reopening across the country. I think they will open up airport or section by section, one region of the country. Also, I might point out, Dan, that what else is closed is that we've got 50 U.S. missions around the world that have been closed down. The State Department says that there have been no specific threats, no direct threats against any embassy or any consulate. There are about 260 of them around the world, but they've left it up to the ambassador or the consul general to take action given their own specific security requirements. And I think about a quarter of those have been closed down as of now.
You know, Ed, increasingly over the last few years, I think this goes back 10 or 15 years, the State Department hasn't been able to get the funds from Congress to significantly upgrade security at most, if not all, U.S. embassies abroad. I wonder if that will change in the wake of what's happened here this week.
Dan, I think it will change. I think that there are a lot of things that will change as a result of what's happened here. Particularly the funding for intelligence and for security at embassies, and I think for the FAA as well.
Ed, switching to something else, I have said repeatedly that it's pretty hard to imagine this operation not being very well financed and extremely well organized. I gather you have a different view of that.
You know, I don't think it takes a lot of money to do this, Dan. I think what you have to have is someone who had enough money to train half a dozen pilots, which is a significant amount of money, but not an extraordinary amount of money. They had to have enough money to get them either to Mexico or Canada to get them in this country. That's an airline ticket. That's not a lot of money. And they had to buy an OAG, an official airline guide, which you can get for a couple of dollars so that they can decide which planes they were going to take. I don't think that it takes a lot of money to do that.
Well, about this, you and I may disagree. My own sense is that there's got to be a Daddy Warbucks somewhere, and that somewhere might be in the capital of some country leading the Hate America charge. But we'll see. You, ladies and gentlemen, are watching continuing CBS News coverage of Attack on America. Attack on America.